Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride. Let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/263, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello everybody and welcome to the 263rd edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name's Tim Mooney and you are here for part 2 of the guide to bicycling the C&O. I guess it's a guide to bicycling the C&O. It is not the guide, although it could be your guide. It is certainly my guide because, look, I've taken you all on a bunch of rides on the C&O, but I've never really done the full guide to cycling yet. Now, last week, we did part 1 of all of that, where I talked about, some frequently asked questions, some background on the nature of the trail and whatnot. I asked you, and a few of you actually chimed in for some things that you'd like me to add to that first part. And then we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to go in section by section for the entire length of the 184.5, don't forget the half mile, from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland. We're going to travel the way that I typically tend to do it from D.C. to Cumberland. And I'll go through each of those 10-mile sections, roughly 10-mile sections, piece by piece, and just give you my thoughts on each of those 18 sections of trail here on this episode. But first, as promised, I got some feedback from folks, and more than one person mentioned that I didn't really get into some of the parallel trails that are available to riders that want to do the C&O, but maybe not necessarily be on the C&O the entire time. So let me mention the two options here. The first option is the real true fork in the road, as noted in the wackadoodle tour that I just went on, the Game of Chance, and that is the Western Maryland Rail Trail. Now, effectively, it's a little bit more than this, but effectively it goes from 11 miles downstream towards DC from Hancock. There's a little parking lot there right off of I-70, and it goes paved trail all the way to Little Orleans with a few on and off options, one of which is forced to the C&O, and that's to avoid some bat habitat. It's a really common alternate for folks through riding the C&O. I, for one, would follow the through hiking, the major Triple Crown through hiking rules, which basically say so long as you are taking a route that is parallel and doesn't cut off miles, then it counts as a through ride of the C&O. If you end up on the Western Maryland Rail Trail, I would not begrudge you and say you have not ridden every single square inch of the C&O. I will say that the portions of the C&O that you miss out on, there's actually some cool stuff in there. I've actually taken you in a few audio journals on that. But definitely an option, definitely an easier ride, particularly when you're coming from Cumberland to DC. It is a largely downhill grade, very, very, very imperceptible, but you do find yourself quite a bit above the trail in parts and do end up descending to river level by the time you're done with things. So definitely an option for you, the Western Maryland Rail Trail. The other, and I, of course, will mention that in the section by section part coming up. The one that I may or may not be mentioning, I don't recall, I've written this all out a while ago, that is less accessible at the moment is the Washington and Old Dominion Trail. Now, it parallels the river on the Virginia side, so the opposite side of the Potomac, from Purcellville, Virginia to Arlington, Virginia. You do have easy options to get from Georgetown / Washington, D.C. to Arlington using one of the many bridges that are crossing the Potomac in the D.C. area. Purcellville, a little bit harder. Actually, you'd be coming, it's a little bit further back, more towards Leesburg. As I mentioned, the upstream access is extremely limited since the closure of the cable ferry at White's Ferry. It used to be that you could cross there on the ferry and then you could end up doing a little bit of road work that takes you into Leesburg. Good wide shoulders, but very busy US 15 in that area. Totally doable, done it before. I have heard that there are shuttles from hotels there on the Virginia side of the river that are going to come and do the long about way to pick you up because the closest bridges are actually actually quite a haul from where you are in White's Ferry, where you would have originally crossed. There's also some other providers that are bringing cyclists back and forth. What I would say is maybe a hotel stay might be an efficient way if you want to do the over 30 miles of paved trail that connects Arlington to Purcellville in lieu of the C&O. Now, I will say you would miss out on some really fantastic parts of the C&O, most notably Great Falls. It would be a really good thing. But I will say that some of the worst parts of the trail when things get flooded are in that section. So some folks need to do that out of necessity no matter what. The WAD, as we call it in the region, Washington and Old Dominion, is a very serviceable trail. It's very popular on weekends. It's just a lot less scenic. And oh, by the way, if you care about such things like I do, lots of sun exposure because there ain't that many trees on the WAD. All right, so let's start by going through section by section on our wonderful Chesapeake and Ohio National Historic Park towpath. And we're going to start off in Washington, D.C., and we're going to go to the Capitol Beltway in this first section. This is mile marker 0 to mile marker number 9. Now, I am going to be reading from my guide to the C&O, and you can see all of this. You can read these things if you would like over on pedalshift.net/Cno, C&O, all spelled out, and you can go to all of this. So here we go. The DC end of the C&O towpath is a bustling, energetic contrast from the solace and quiet only a few miles away. Bike shops and abundant food choices greet you in Georgetown, some just steps away from the towpath. Mile marker 0 is often a bit tricky to find for newcomers, as the historic towpath dumps cyclists onto the Rock Creek Parkway Trail without a sign to find what many are there to complete or begin their journey, a view of the canal opening into the Potomac River. Luckily, there are videos showing how to access the marker. Sidebar, if you'd like a link to some of those videos, you can check out the guidebook. Also, you can just Google it because they're really easy to find. For completists, riding the historic towpath through Georgetown is likely a must. For others, riding along Georgetown Waterfront Park to the entrance of the paved Capitol Crescent Trail is a better alternative. The paved trail parallels the historic towpath, where one can trade pavement for gravel a few miles down at Fletcher's Boathouse. That, by the way, is something that I always choose when I am riding the C&O. Going through Georgetown is challenging, shall we say, if you're trying to make time or get someplace. And if you've already seen it once, like me, well, it's skippable. The Capitol Crescent Trail is a great paved alternative for you. During good weather, this is one of the two busiest stretches of the towpath. Washington is the largest city by far on the route, and locals are out in force, particularly on weekends. You might even find me. Normal trail etiquette is to ride single file and announce when passing, just like any major trail in the U.S. Don't be surprised to see runners, walkers, and even a kayaker or two on this section. The towpath crosses the District Maryland border and continues its journey to some of the outer suburbs. If you're beginning or ending your journey, you may find it tempting to pass by some of the historic locks and signs, but take a water break here and there to soak some of it in. The distant highway hum you pick up from afar is the Capitol Beltway, the unofficial signal that you are either entering or leaving the DC area. The trail quality under the Beltway is notoriously awful, and the area is not well lit, regardless of the time of day. Pump the brakes a tad when you go under and keep an eye out for ruts. Safety. A common question posed by newcomers: is it safe in DC? Generally, the district is as safe as any other major city in the world. There's the added benefit that the towpath travels through some of the wealthiest suburbs in the United States, and the terminus is in arguably the ritziest section of the district. That said, this is a city. Do not expect to leave your bike unlocked and find it there when you return for a leisurely coffee in Georgetown. If you're staying at a hotel or a hostel in DC, ask ahead about bike parking options. Secure indoor options are better than outdoors, but a good lock is a must. Camping options. There are no campsites on this portion of the C&O between mile marker 0 and mile marker 9 / the Capitol Beltway, although I have done a wild camp not too far from there once. Check out past episodes for that. All right, next section. Between the Capitol Beltway and Great Falls, mile markers 9 through mile marker 20. The most popular section of the towpath may be the least inviting to ride at times, particularly if you enjoy the solace of escape. On weekends, particularly those with good weather, this section of the trail is packed with people, often slowing one's pace to a crawl. While most users of the towpath are good citizens who lovingly share the space with loaded bike tourists, it seems the section has more people oblivious to calls of "on your left" than you can shake a stick at. Practice patience during those times. Negativity aside, this is a beautiful stretch of the river and the towpath. One of the most stunning sections is the broad reservoir of the canal east of Great Falls. The landscape has a unique feel and topography compared to the rest of the trail. It's a great spot for a water break at one of the several benches. Don't get used to those, though. They're a rare sight on the remainder of the towpath headed west. The main highlight is unsurprisingly the main attraction. That's Great Falls. An old school bike rack, one of those old school staple bike racks, actually, really like old school, allows you to lock your bike. Sadly, no bikes are allowed in that section, and walk over a series of bridges and boardwalks to a stunning vista of the main falls on the Potomac. It's worth a stop, whether you're starting or ending your 15-ish miles away from DC. Note that the bridge and overlook was closed during the summer of 2017 for maintenance and sometimes is closed here and there depending on conditions. Great Falls is a good marker for the towpath. Heading to DC, one is greeted with more contact with civilization, transforming from rural to suburban to urban as the ride progresses. Heading towards Cumberland, towpath riders get their first taste of true solitude within a few miles. It's also the beginning of the 31 hiker-biker campsites, perhaps the best aspect of the towpath for self-supported bicycle tourists. Camping. Swains Lock, mile marker 16.6. I have rated it 4 stars for location, 5 stars for vehicle access, nice parking, 2 stars for noise, 4 stars for beauty, 5 stars for river access, 1 star for trail town amenities, and 3 stars for cell phone signals. I think it's actually gotten better than that. And of course, a reminder, all of these campsites I've got on YouTube for you to take a look at so you can get an eyeball view of these campsites before you give them a shot. Moving on to our next section between mile marker 20 and mile marker 30. This is between Great Falls and Edwards Ferry or Leesburg. This portion of the towpath is a stellar section for those that want to do an overnight tour starting in DC. It also features the first truly rural section of the path west of mile marker 22. This stretch features the first of many green tunnels along the towpath. At the height of summer foliage, the tree canopy completely covers the trail, giving a feeling of enclosure that is simultaneously comforting and invigorating. A downside to this coverage is the inability of the sunlight to penetrate and dry the trail after some of the region's typical thunderstorms. This can make for a muddy ride and one of the several stretches that make having fenders on your bicycle recommended, if not required. The highlights of this section is largely the trail itself. Be sure to take some time to enjoy some of the wildlife encounters you're likely to have, even if it's just a brief glimpse at a turtle leaping from its sunning spot into the water as you roll by. Camping. Horse Pen Branch, mile marker 26.1. Sidebar on this. I don't give ratings to all of the camping spots on this guide, but I'll read them if I have them. I will also note for the record that Horse Pen Branch is the first of the typical camping opportunities. This is one where there's no parking lot anywhere nearby. It's the one where the porta potty situation is different. There's no city water. This is the beginning of the typical setup for your camping. Beauty, I give it 3 stars. River access, 3 stars. Trail town amenities, 1 star. They ain't any nearby. And cell phone signals, 2. You can get a signal on AT&T, but it's tough with some of the other carriers. Man, I'm telling you, if you're Sprint or T-Mobile, I guess it's all T-Mobile now. Not a lot of signal on the trail. Anyways, that is Great Falls to Edwards Ferry and Leesburg, mile marker 20 to mile marker 30. By the way, Leesburg is on the Virginia side of the river. Don't go thinking that you can get to Leesburg very easily from the trail. Next section, Edwards Ferry to Dickerson, mile marker 30 to mile marker 40. If you're starting from the DC end of things, this is where the towpath really blossoms. If you're ending your ride in DC, this is the last bit of the wild trail before you start entering the influence of DC suburbia. From mile marker 30 to 35, the trail is surrounded by tall trees close to the towpath. During the summer, this can be a welcome bit of shade from the often impressive heat you'll encounter. The downside of the shade is, as I mentioned before, the slower evaporation of pooled water following the frequent thunderstorms of the season. If rain has fallen within a few days of your ride, this can be one of the muddier sections you'll encounter, so be prepared. Of course, during peak foliage, this is one of the more stunning rides on the entire trail. Midway through this section is White's Ferry, the sole remaining cable ferry across the Potomac River. The Jubal A. Early used to run from the crack of dawn or earlier to late at night, ferrying bikes, pedestrians, and cars back and forth between Maryland and Virginia. If you need amenities of a town during this portion of your ride, well, Leesburg would have been your spot only a few miles away from the far side of the river. However, as we all know, the Jubal A. Early is currently dry docked because the entire ferry is closed for who knows how long, maybe permanently. If you do get to the other side of the river, be prepared for a bit of a shock to the system after hours or even days of car-free riding. Although the road shoulders are wide and welcoming to bicycles, the highway that takes you into Leesburg is well traveled. One other potential benefit, if the ferry ever reopens, as for those weary of the towpath heading to or from DC, is the easy connection to the Washington and Old Dominion Trail, a paved path that takes one back to the suburb of Arlington, Virginia, and connecting trails to the district. The ferry ride was worth it alone, just even for the views. So if it ever does reopen and you are set to remain on the C&O, consider taking a break for the ride. If it opens up again and the same costs are there, it was a $3 charge per direction. So it's not inexpensive, but river crossings, as we have learned since its closure, aren't ubiquitous on this adventure, and this one is definitely unique. So we hope it comes back. From mile marker 35 to 40, it's back into the wild. Excellent camping options in the stretch, and usually excellent trail conditions greet you as a rider. One bit of a side note, this is where the brand new section of the trail, the new surface, comes about from about mile marker 35 on. So trail conditions go way through the roof. You are now leaving the historic towpath surface. Camping. Mile marker 30.5 is Chisel Branch. I don't have any ratings in the guide as of the moment, so check it out on YouTube. Ditto for Turtle Run, mile marker 34.43. I will note that Chisel Branch is subject to some flooding. Turtle Run typically is not. Mile marker 38.2 Marble Quarry, you're also away from some of the flooding possibilities. You're up a bit. All of these are reviewed fully on YouTube and at the Pedalshift Guide to the C&O, pedalshift.com/Cando. Moving on to the next section. Dickerson to Point of Rocks, mile marker 40 to mile marker 50. This is the towpath at its most classic. Remote for most of the stretch, but not outside of the comforts of cell towers and other touches of civilization if it's necessary for you. Wildlife along this portion of the trail tends to make an appearance regardless of season, largely due to the fact that fewer humans patrol this stretch compared to the parts closer to Harpers Ferry or the DC suburbs. The highlight of this section is Monocacy Aqueduct, rebuilt from flood-aided destruction in 2005. I love that, flood-aided destruction. It still has the seems newer than it should feel, but it's always a pleasure to ride through. Be sure to stop and take a few pictures or linger for the views of the river. On many nice days, you might spot small boats with anglers trying to catch that elusive fish. Point of Rocks, Maryland is a good stop for a snack at Deli on the Rocks, especially if you're craving something more than that bar or trail mix in your handlebar bag. The fries are legit. I mean, so I hear. Okay, no, I've eaten many of their fries. I will note that this is the first real opportunity for kind of outside food. There are opportunities coming from DC out there, notably the snack bar at Great Falls. But if you don't want to travel far from the trail, the Deli on the Rocks is really your first opportunity. Somebody can yell at me if that's not the case in their opinion. Camping. Mile marker 42.5. Indian Flats. That's a good one if memory serves. Mile marker 47.6. Calico Rocks. Love the name of that one. Calico Rocks. Such imagery with that. So that is it. Dickerson to Point of Rocks. You've gone 50 miles with me already. Next one, Point of Rocks to Harpers Ferry. Mile marker 50 to 60. This section of the towpath has a companion. The CSX and Amtrak rail line hugs the far side of the canal bank. Take a break and watch the train zoom by and maybe wave to passengers on the Capital Limited on their way to DC or Pittsburgh. Midway through the section is the town of Brunswick, Maryland, which is a recommended stop for grabbing food and water. Unlike Harpers Ferry, Brunswick lies on your side of the river, making its bounty much more accessible than its West Virginia rival. The excellent Beans in the Belfry is worth a stop, if only to grab a cup of coffee in a beautifully restored former church, adding stained glass windows with your caffeine boost. Closer to Harpers Ferry, the trail shares space with the Appalachian Trail, so be on the lookout for hikers hauling their gear on their backs, and think how much better it is to have yours strapped to your bike. This is one of my favorite sections of the trail, by the way, and I cannot over recommend Brunswick. There's also good beer there. There's a decent pizza place, and by decent I mean halfway decent. But lots of opportunities for food there. You don't have to cross the river into Harpers Ferry, as I mentioned. I've gotten much more into Brunswick than going into Harpers Ferry these days. Camping. Mile marker 50, Bald Eagle Island. Noisy rail there, but it's a good campground. But that's the only one in this section, because there's a bit of a break for a while until the next section, Harpers Ferry to Antietam/Shepherdstown. I will note for the record, this is usually where you're going to be spending your first night if you were going in the direction as we're going from DC towards Cumberland. One of the quieter 10-mile stretches on the entire towpath still has two important points to note. First is arguably the best campsite on the entire trail at Huckleberry Hill. Its proximity to Brunswick and Harpers Ferry, plus the spacing for those doing the trail in 3 roughly 60-mile days, means it's a perfect spot to pitch a tent or to hang a hammock. Second is the Antietam Aqueduct, which is yet another of the stone monoliths that greet you from time to time on the towpath. You're a few miles, 2-ish to be exact, to Shepherdstown, West Virginia. If it's time for a break, consider riding on and checking it out. It's, of course, going to be in the next section here. As I mentioned, camping, mile marker 62.9, Huckleberry Hill. I mean, it is, it's just such a glorious place. I haven't camped there all this year, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be, unless I make a special trip to do it. This might be the first year that I've ever not camped at Huckleberry Hill, and I'm starting to regret that because it is a really special place for me on the trail. Arguably one of my most favorite spots on the trail, if only because it comes with great memories. That's Harpers Ferry to Antietam/Shepherdstown, mile marker 60 to mile marker 70. Next one, Antietam/Shepherdstown to Taylor's Landing. This is mile markers 70 to 80. This 10-mile stretch, like so many of the others, is mostly open trail. Other than the great trail town of Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and a possible side trip to Antietam and the National Battleground, you'll probably be pedaling through much of this without too much to distract you with a stop. So, Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I'm not saying it's the best trail town on the river, but it certainly has some of the best offerings. Let's pour one out for Mellow Moods, which was one of my favorite places in Shepherdstown. It was an ideal spot for the vegetarian or vegan inclined, but there are plenty of other opportunities for both you carnivores, you omnivores, and you vegivores. Well, anyways, the town's bakery is amazing. I also recommend Maria's Taqueria. It's one of the most excellent spots to grab some calories, and it is just fabulous people there as well. Whether it's the beginning or the end of your day, Shepherdstown is worth crossing the river. If staying on the Maryland side is more your speed, Antietam is not too far away, but expect some hills. I will say, if you're a Civil War buff and you pass Antietam, you're missing out. It's definitely a place to go to. I am kind of like interested, but not a huge Civil War guy. I mean, Civil War guy, what is that? But I've been to the battlefield, and it's a very somber spot, a very important place in the history of this country for sure. But Shepherdstown, I live about 45 minutes by vehicle from Shepherdstown, and we often make that sojourn out there a lot. It's just a very cute little town, and it does a really nice job of catering to folks on bikes. It's really easy to get to from the trail. It is a big twirly ramp that gets you up to the bridge, and then there's big wide shoulders and bike lanes for you in the town of Shepherdstown. So definitely worthy of a spot, especially that would be a good breakfast opportunity for you if you're heading the direction that we are going. The bakery is awesome, and I would also recommend, if the taqueria is open by that point, Might be a little too early in the morning for them to be open, but it's a good place to load up on some burritos or other things like that for later on in the day, because as we're going to discover, things get pretty rural for the next stretch. Camping, Killiansburg Cave, mile marker 75.2. If you are going from DC and you still feel like you got some miles in you, note for the record that it is a big gap, one of the bigger gaps between Huckleberry Hill and the next campsite. Killiansburg Cave. It's about 13 miles. That may seem like not a lot, but when you get used to having camping every 5 miles, it is a big gap. That's why lots of people end up ending their days on the first day at Huckleberry Hill. Also in this stretch is Horseshoe Bend, mile marker 79.2. Really good one. I've stayed at both of them. I actually rather like both of those spots. That is mile marker 70 to 80. Now moving on to mile marker 80 to 90. That's Taylor's Landing to Opequon Junction. And I'm probably mispronouncing that. I can never remember if it's Opequon or Opequon. We'll call it Opequon. This stretch of trail is highlighted by the absence of towns and amenities, which is a feature if you're doing the ride for an escape, let's be honest. If you're taking your time riding the trail, this is a fantastic segment to take a break at one of the campsites and fill up on water if the handles are on. There's one small store about a mile off the towpath in Downsville, but other than that, plan for a different segment for stores and civilization. And by the way, that store is still open. I just double checked. It's the Downsville General Store, something like that. The fun part about this section is a portion of the trail called Big Slackwater between mile markers 84 and 88. For years, we had to do a long boring road detour around this section until the National Park Service built the concrete trail hugging the banks of the Potomac. After miles of crushed limestone, usually feels great to transition to a few miles on a smooth surface. Keep an eye out, though, for hordes of swimming teenagers during nicer weather. They like to swim there, and they jump off of it, and they tend to aggregate in large groups. Not thinking about cyclists coming through. Anyways, sidebar. If the river levels are high, it's not unusual for this portion to be underwater. That puts you on a boring detour, but it's always well signed if the Park Service closes the trail. By the way, very recently they have had to do that. There is a big detour that actually is not related to Big Slackwater, but covers that same boring detour. Just as a heads up, as we record this here in 2021. Camping, pretty good options in this one. It is, when I say options, I mean option. Big Woods at mile marker 82.46. I would say, that's a pretty good one. I don't think there's a bad one here on the trail, but it just depends. What are your needs? If you're ready to stop for the night and you're around mile marker 80ish or so, well, Big Woods is your best option. It's a pretty good one. Go check that out over on the YouTube or at the guide that I am reading from. Next up, we're going to cover mile markers 90 to 100, and we're going from Opequon Junction to the town of Williamsport, which is almost exactly at mile marker 100 if memory serves. Several interesting things of note on this stretch, which has the theme of, no, not that one, it's the other one. Why that theme? Two prominent features have names from better-known versions. First, Falling Waters. No, not the famous architect's home. It's a minor Civil War landmark where the Confederates fled across the Potomac after their defeat in Gettysburg. Some would say ass-whooping, but that's just me. But it has a sign, so take a second to read it and be happy that you are not one of those countless disappointed people thinking you'd be rocking some peeps at a home designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. That's in Pennsylvania. Look it up. Second, Williamsport. No, not the town with the Little League Baseball. It's a trail town with one of the best cafes, Desert Rose Cafe, in the entire stretch. I really like them. The owners are nice. They're very, very cool. Plus, there's a nice National Park Service Visitor Center there in Williamsport as well. By the way, I got to do this right. Cnococheek. That is how you pronounce that big road. Roll like the locals do, not like me, because I can never pronounce this. Cnococheek. That's the name. That's the thing that you'll see there in Williamsport, the main road. So this might not be the Falling Waters or the Williamsports that you are looking for, but they are nice substitutes. Also on the stretch, another interstate bypass. Well, going this direction, your first one. Well, no, that's not true because you went under the Beltway. Another interstate bypass. This time it's I-81, a major north-south route in the region. The bridge spanning the Potomac is seemingly always under construction. It's true. And this sometimes impacts the trail below, but generally you won't have to do more than steer around a small bypass. One other interesting point of note, a gun and fishing club sits right on the trail around mile marker 94. It's a private club, so trespassing isn't advised. It's a gun and fishing club. Do I have to say trespassing's not advised? Gun and fishing club. Camping. Mile marker 90.9 Opequon Junction. That's a good one. Mile marker 95.2 Cumberland Valley. Not sure if I've actually stayed at Cumberland Valley. I have to think about that. I need to go through these one time, decide if I've stayed at all of them. I think I mentioned on a past pod that I want to stay at every single one at some point, but that would require me to figure out which ones I haven't stayed at yet so that I can make a plan. That is mile markers 90 through 100. Moving on. Mile marker 100 through 110, Williamsport. No, not that one, the other one, to Fort Frederick. Another stretch of the towpath that qualifies as middle of nowhere. This is a great escape point for cyclists trying to get away from it all. The one thing that stands out in this section is how the towpath takes a shortcut rather than following the river for a mile or two around mile marker 108. By the way, when you're riding, you don't notice this at all. This is actually a good time to say. It feels like when you're riding on the trail that you are riding arrow straight the entire time. But if you look on a map, and I invite you to do that, you are constantly turning and moving and curving. And really the only way that you're going to be able to figure that out visually is the position of the sun relative to where you're at during the time of day. If you are riding on a cloudy day, you will think that you are going arrow straight the entire time. It's a really great example of why getting lost is really, really easy and finding your way back would be really, really hard. None of this is written down, by the way. I just made that all up. Mile marker 101.2 Jordan Junction. I know I've never stayed there. If you'd given me a list of names of hiker-biker sites on the C&O and you said Jordan Junction, one of them was wrong, I would have picked Jordan Junction. Never stayed at it. Mile marker 110 North Mountain. I've stayed there. That's kind of a cool one, actually. That's mile markers 100 through 110. Moving on from Fort Frederick to Little Pool. We are in my neck of the woods. This is the section of the towpath that is directly across from where I'm at in West Virginia. I've heard people consider this a tough stretch of trail. The excellent Bike Washington guide concurs. I'm not sure this is any more difficult riding than any of the others, to be honest, but the timing of your ride might be a piece of it. If you're coming from DC and ending a second day in or near Hancock, this section is at the end of your day, and fatigue is certainly a factor as you're heading 50 miles or more into your day. Tree cover disappears for portions of the ride, especially as you approach Little Pool and Big Pool, an extended lake-like section of the Old Canal. Wildlife encounters in this area are outstanding, particularly birds. Keep an eye out for turtles in the water sunning themselves on stumps. They're a fun excuse to squeeze the brakes and take a picture. I do it every time. My partner is a huge fan of turtles, so I do that every single time, and it brings great joy in my life and hers. One other feature of this section is the option to hop off the towpath and ride the paved Western Maryland Rail Trail. The downside is you lose access to a few of the campgrounds, so be sure to check those maps if you're planning to camp on the C&O, but ride a stretch of the Western Maryland Rail Trail. It runs parallel from mile marker 114 to 141. Camping in this section, mile marker 110 North Mountain. I think we mentioned that last time. Well, because it's precisely on mile marker 110 and it overlaps both these sections. Mile marker 116, Licking Creek, I have stayed there. That's a good one. Mile marker 120.6, Little Pool, I have also stayed there. Go check out the reviews on the YouTubes. Moving on to the end of your second day, roughly, is going to be in this section, and that's mile marker 120 to 130. This is Little Pool, Hancock, and Leopards Mill in this section. Odds are you might be ending your day at one of the campsites in this stretch, if only to take advantage of Hancock's plentiful options right off the trail. This is the last bike shop until Cumberland to the west and Brunswick to the east. There's also an abundance of food options, from gas station cuisine to full sit-down restaurants. But if you're doing it right, you get pie at Weaver's, which is possibly the best sugar-laden option on the entire towpath. I'm going to stop right here. If you were doing this trail for the first time and you have an opportunity to go to Weaver's and you do not, I never say you're doing it wrong. But in this one instance, I'm telling you, you're doing it wrong. Unless I guess you hate pie. I don't eat sugar usually, but I make an exception. And I live near Weaver's. I don't go there very often, but when I do, it's when I'm riding the C&O. Stop at Weaver's. Go get pie. Crying out loud. A few shower options for the campers on this tour are in the stretch. And if you aren't rinsing off in the river or with a good pannier full of water dumped in your head, I plead guilty to both of those, you might do everyone a favor by getting a shower at the C&O Bicycles bunkhouse at Fort Frederick or at the very small park. I'm adding this last part because I realize there is an outdoor shower also at the very small park that is right in the town of Hancock. It's right below stair access from the Western Maryland Rail Trail. You can get to that pretty easily. If you are going into town for gas station cuisine, there's a Sheetz nearby there. There's also a Subway as well there. There's also a grocery store over in that direction. But that outdoor shower faces the Western Maryland Rail Trail. If you blink, you'll miss it. Another thing that I'll say is that if you want to do free camping, you are allowed to actually camp at that park as well. I've never done that because you're a little exposed in a town that I kind of have a love-hate relationship with. There are so many camping options in this area, both paid and free. Lots and lots of opportunities. The abandoned and very spooky cement mill, which I have mentioned many times on this podcast, is a highlight, and it's around mile marker 128. One other feature of the section is the option to hop off the towpath and ride the paved Western Maryland Rail Trail, as I've mentioned before. The downside, as I mentioned before, is you lose access to a few of those campgrounds, so make sure you check your maps if you decide to hop off and ride the paved route, because the campgrounds are all on C&O, and you have limited access between the two trails. Camping, mile marker 120.6 Little Pool, mile marker 126.4 White Rock, and mile marker 129.9 Leopards Mill. And I have great memories with Bellstar at White Rock and Leopards Mill, as I've talked about before. All right, let's go off into the wilderness. Mile marker 130 to 140. This is the last section of the trail as we are heading towards Cumberland. This is Leopards Mill to Little Orleans. This is one of my favorite stretches of the towpath, if only for its sheer remoteness. Cell phone coverage is spotty, and odds are you won't run into too many people. If you're coming from DC and you felt isolated in other sections, it's going to kick in for real now. But don't worry, because just to the west is a must stop at Bill's Place for a touch of civilization. If you're coming from the west, it's more of what you've had since the Paw Paw Tunnel. I will say Bill's Place is kind of a hit and miss thing for me, as I've talked about on the show. It's worth going to at least once. It's kind of like your average, kind of country dive bar. It's worth going to. I think its veneration might be a tad overrated, but maybe it's because I've had the opportunity to go multiple times. You should go. One other feature of this section is the option to hop off the towpath and ride the paved Western Maryland Rail Trail. Say it with me, folks. The downside is you lose out on some of the campgrounds. I clearly copied and pasted the same thing in every section, so I will not belabor the point. You already know all about it. Camping in this incredibly rural section includes Leopards Mill, which I already talked about at 129.9, Opequon Junction at mile marker 133.6, Indigo Neck. That's a good one. 139.2. Love the name of that one. Let's go further into the sticks. Little Orleans to Stickpile Hill, mile marker 140 to 150. This is another stretch of wilderness-like trail, except for the very small town of Little Orleans. It consists of a private campground, which seems nice enough and has showers if you need one, but I usually prefer staying at the free C&O ones. And of course, as I mentioned, the legendary Bill's Place. Real talk here. Oh wait, I did write this. Okay, we're going to repeat. Now we're just going to read what's in my thing. Real talk here. I don't tend to hang out at Bill's too much, but it's largely because I'm trying to keep moving to Cumberland or Hancock, depending on the direction I'm headed. Some people love it. It's literally the only place for miles in any direction, so it's worth a stop, if only to cool off for a beverage, adult or otherwise. Yeah, that was a much better way of saying it than my meandering nonsense that I said a few minutes ago. The newest stretch of the Western Maryland Rail Trail can be picked up in Little Orleans, or if you're Cumberland bound, that's where you want to get off to rejoin the C&O. If you want close to 30 miles of paved trail after some time on the dirt, it's a great option. I know that's a lot of repeating, but I figure I may as well read it to you. Camping in this stretch is great, and the remoteness is a real plus. I really can't emphasize enough how great the campsites are in here. Devil's Alley, I love. For whatever reason, that's a really popular one I tend to find. And then Stickpile Hill is another really good one near mile marker 150. Both excellent campgrounds. That's Little Orleans to Stickpile Hill, mile marker 140 to 150. Next up, Stickpile Hill, Paw Paw, and Town Creek, mile markers 150 to 160. First, the good news. This is one of the cooler parts of the towpath. Now, the bad. If you're biking this in the spring or summer of 2018, you might miss part of it. Well, actually, it's more than that. If you're cycling it in the fall of 2021, you will miss part of it. The Paw Paw Tunnel is closed for rock scaling work, which is fancy talk for preventing big-ass boulders from coming down the sides of tall mountains and squishing nice bike tourists. So there's that. Upside, you get to push your ride up the mountain rather than through it. That is not much upside. And for more on that, you can go check out the past podcast where I did that. The tunnel may seem to be a rundown relic of the past. I mean, it is. But don't let the musty smell and horror movie vibe fool you. This was a technological marvel for its time. Consider the alternative for boats was to traverse a relatively impassable section of the Potomac as it cut through the mountains, and you'll understand why the powers that be of the day decided to blow a mile-long tunnel through the Catoctin mountain range and line it with bricks created on site by a specially built brick factory. A big project in the 21st century, one of a kind for the 19th. If you are able to go through the tunnel, be prepared for dark conditions and uneven footing. It's possible to ride through it, but trust me, and my skinned knees and the falls that I've taken, it's not advised. A headlamp and a bit of patience are your two best tools for getting to the other side. If your aim for biking the C&O is to get away from it all, this section is your crown jewel. There's not a lot of people outside of the tunnel campground and the northern western entrance, and cell phones have nothing to connect with. In other words, perfect. One thing I'll say is that I think that there's been some additional cell phone towers that have been put in the Paw Paw area, so you might be able to grab a signal on the far side of the tunnel, the Cumberland side of the tunnel, if memory serves. But definitely cell phone signals are not at a premium. What's the opposite of a premium? They're scarce. They're hard to come by. The small town of Paw Paw, West Virginia is easily accessible by bridge over the river. There are limited services, but if you're after some food, this is the only option for a bunch of miles. Camping. Mile marker 149.4, Stickpile Hill. No cell phone reception. Ditto for Sorrel Ridge. By the way, this is mile marker 154.1. It is the one that is unsigned, but I think that there might be a temporary sign up finally up there. It's kind of weird. It was unsigned for years. Mile marker 156.9, Purcellville Run. Very strange name, but Purcellville Run. I think I've stayed there. I think that's a good one. Mile marker 156.9. Man, we are running out of trail, folks. Here's mile marker 160 to 170, Town Creek to Pigmans Ferry. Westbounders are starting to feel the first signs of leaving the wilderness. Eastbounders are starting to leave the influences of Cumberland behind. Potomac Forks is one of my favorite campsites in the whole stretch, largely because of its unique setup off the trail. Too bad it's so close to Cumberland because I'm usually rolling past it. Old Town is the only shot at food around mile marker 167 in this section, but I don't recommend the sole offering the schoolhouse kitchen. Better to hold out until Cumberland or plan ahead to have food with you. If you would like to know why I don't like the schoolhouse kitchen, ask me sometime over a beer. Camping, mile marker 162.1, Town Creek. You can get a bit of cell phone reception here, by the way, which is often the first in that direction since Paw Paw, or even much before that. Mile marker 164.8, Potomac Forks. You can get cell phone reception there. I love this campsite. It's my second favorite one on the entire trail. And it's unique because the campground is on the opposite side of the trail. It's set up in a way I really like it. There's one of the old lock houses there, but it's completely boarded up. But it's just kind of a cool little place. There's a bridge over the trail as well. Check out the review on the website. I think it's one of my favorites. Pigmans Ferry at 169.1 does get some cell phone reception, kind of weak, but pretty good. Its notable thing is it's a gigantic field, very unusual compared to the rest of the campsites. It allows you to get some sun on wet gear. I really would recommend that if it fits in your plans and you have wet gear to air out or to sun out. Folks, we are on the final section of the trail. Thank you for sticking with me. This is an extra long pod. I thought about splitting this up into yet another one, but I thought, you know what? Supersized pod for you all. Also makes more sense to keep these all together. Final section of the trail. Pigmans Ferry to Cumberland. Mile marker 170 to 184.5. This is a supersized section, considering normally I've been doing 10-mile sections. It either begins or it ends here. If you're starting in Cumberland, be mindful that there aren't a ton of amenities between there and Hancock. If you plan on taking a night or more in between, make sure you have some food with you. If you're in the home stretch, especially if you started in DC, this is a victory lap of sorts. The world slowly comes back as you roll, feeling exurban, then suburban, and then the small city of Cumberland shows up as a finish line. Trains are a companion near Cumberland, often parked for mile-long stretches on the outskirts of town. Sidebar, by the way, somebody reached out recently on the YouTube channel and talked about the folks, the train riders, they'll refer to themselves as hobos, so I will use that term, that they will often camp in this area as well because there is a rail yard there and it's easy on, easy off for those folks who ride the trains illegally, which is a fascinating thing to me, and I've talked about that on the pod before. Cumberland has every amenity you'll need. A bike shop, tons of restaurants and bars, plus a few hotels that cater to bike tourists. The Cno Visitor Center is precisely at the end of the trail, along with signs for the Great Allegheny Passage, which serves as a siren call to continue even after 184.5 miles. Personal preference? Look, I always stop at the Krabby Pig to celebrate the beginning or the end of my tour. It's not the greatest place in the history of dining, but pretty good. And hey, tradition. Unnecessary trivia. I love that I put this in here. Unnecessary trivia. Convicted murderer Jeffrey McDonald, made famous by the book and miniseries Fatal Vision, is imprisoned at the Federal Correctional Facility a stone's throw from the trail in Cumberland. He probably killed his wife and kids, but maybe not. Sleep tight. I love that's the end of my guide. Camping, mile marker 169.1, Pigmans Ferry. You get some cell phone reception, as I said. Irons Mountain, not Iron Mountain. It is Irons Mountain. It is not possessive Irons Mountain. It is Irons, I-O-R-O-N-S, no apostrophe, Irons Mountain. Good cell phone reception there. That's at 175.30. I don't think I've ever stayed there. Evetts Creek, 180.1. This is the final campsite on the C&O before you get into Cumberland. It's handy, it's nice. The trains are freaking loud as heck if they're parked there often, especially during the summer. Great cell phone reception there. You might get to hang out with folks who ride trains, illegally and stuff. There's also, of course, as I mentioned, hotel options in town. There's also the YMCA, which gives you access to their showers and their facilities. I've stayed there a few times. It's pretty reasonably priced. You can check that out on the YMCA of Cumberland's website. Folks, that is it. That is the C&O by section. We have ridden, sort of, 184.5 miles. And I love this trail. If it hasn't been apparent in all 263 odd episodes of this show, I think it's a really fabulous thing. If you haven't ridden it before, I hope this audio guide maybe sparks some thoughts about riding it, because I think everybody who does bike touring who's got the capability to do it should ride this trail. And as I mentioned, I said, hey, if you want me to do the Great Allegheny Passage audio guide, I'll do it. Well, I got enough people saying, hey, do it. So we're going to do that sometime this winter. Some kind of an audio guide for the Great Allegheny Passage, which means I actually have to write it. This was easier. I wrote this forever ago. I got to edit it because I noticed there's a few things that are out of date. But go check out the print version of this with all sorts of amenities, including links to the videos for the campgrounds and some other things, some maps as well. I've got Google Maps for each and every single one of these sections embedded into the website. That is at pedalshift.net/C&O. Thanks so much for joining, and we will see you next week with a very, very special Thanksgiving episode, and I'm not going to ruin it, and you can't make me either. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours like this fall's upcoming bike tour. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options if you're not into the small monthly thing. Check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lane, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Dengler, Steve Hankel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Biggle, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Krotke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Azuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponsell, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, and Dave Fletcher. And thanks also to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.